And welcome to the August edition of the Cover Crop Cocktails ICCON call. Glad to have everybody with us this morning. For those of you that may not know me, I'm Toris Background. I'm the Midwest Conservation Agronomist with American Farmland Trust. I serve as MC for these calls. So to get started, we want to just make everybody aware that all these calls are going to be recorded and we are going to post them on our public YouTube page. So to get started, if everybody would please just use the chat function and please tell us your name, your organization, your occupation, and kind of where you're located. Kind of get to know everybody in the chat. Would appreciate that. We usually have a this or that question. We don't have one of those today, so we'll just go right to our poll. Catherine, if you want to go ahead and get our poll launched. Everybody take a few minutes to answer that. And then Catherine, whenever the poll is closed, I don't know if I'll be able to see those results or not. Okay, there we go. 75% somewhat familiar and 25% very familiar. Okay, well, hopefully we'll get everybody to the very familiar. All right, so we can go ahead and go to our next slide. So today we are joined by Bethany Bedeker from the Center for Regenerative Agriculture at the University of Missouri-Columbia. Is that correct? And she's here with us today. She is an Illinois native, so props to her for being from Illinois. I'll let her go into a more in-depth introduction of herself, but she's here today to speak to us on how to develop cover crop mixes to improve certain field conditions or address specific resource concerns. Today, we're going to try to focus on addressing compaction and weed suppression. So with that, I think we will go ahead and stop our screen share, and Bethany will let you share your screen and let you get started.
Sounds good. Let's see. All right, does that look good to you?
Looks good.
Great. So thank you all for having me today. I typically listen into these as a participant, so this has been a really great series so far, talking about the cover crop cocktails and just kind of what I consider really to be taking cover crops to the next level. And today we're going to talk about how to kind of go about choosing mixes or species for mixes, especially when you maybe have some specific concerns for your fields. But my name is Bethany Bedeker, and I am the cover crop outreach manager at the Center for Regenerative Agriculture, which is housed at the University of Missouri. I do think it's always great to kind of know a little bit about who's talking to you. So this is just a pretty brief overview of my background. Like Tori said, I'm actually an Illinois gal, born and raised up there in LaSalle County in Red. And I ended up completing my undergrad at Illinois State for agronomy management and agribusiness. And I must have liked it there because I went out in industry for a couple of years and then ended up going back for my master's. And then I graduated last spring, hopped the border over here to Central Missouri and started working for the Center for Regenerative Agriculture, where I basically coordinate a lot of the cover crop research that goes on over here. So obviously, given that brief timeline, that means I'm still pretty green, pun intended, in the world of cover crop advocacy. So as much as I don't yet consider myself a quote unquote expert on cover crops, I do get to work with a lot of really great individuals and groups that have decades of cover crop experience. And also learn from a lot of very forward-thinking farmers that I think are typically ahead of some of the work going on in universities, and then kind of get to help aggregate all of that information through my work at the center. And since we are based out of Missouri and also a relatively new organization, I figure some of you are probably maybe wondering what the Center for Regenerative Agriculture is. So I wanted to just kind of briefly give you a little context about that. This screen here is just a screenshot of our website and then our web link if you wanted to click around in there. Although we're housed in Missouri, we don't consider ourselves to serve just Missouri, and we do a lot of work with the broader Midwest. But I find a great way to explain what the center is with a little bit of a timeline for context. So we were launched as the first Center for Regenerative Agriculture in the Midwest, and that was about like 2.5 years ago. And the need for that kind of came out of a lot of those headlines that started to come out in 2020, where there were a lot of these large corporations setting these lofty goals for this new term of regenerative agriculture. And they kind of noted this need to meet that demand on the agricultural production side and be able to provide resources and programs to support that. So Dr. Rob Myers has many years of experience, especially in cover crops and advocacy, and he's longtime affiliated with SARE, and he ended up being established as our center director. And then later we brought on our assistant director later that summer. And then in that fall of 21, launched a website, which is just full of resources and articles pertaining to a lot of topic areas in regenerative agriculture. So then I joined the spring last year, joined in the spring of last year. And then that fall is when things really started to kind of kick into gear for us. And that came through the announcements of all the Partnership for Climate Smart Commodities projects, which I believe you've all been having, or Illinois Sustainable Ag Partnership, I believe I've seen has been having some webinars talking about a lot of these projects. So we're kind of tied into two of them. So we were specifically awarded one that we're leading for the state of Missouri. And that one, about 70% of our funding is going out to incentive payments for Missouri farmers. And then we're also a partner on the 20-state Farmers for Soil Health project, which does touch Illinois. And our role in that is we're working alongside the Soil Health Initiative to lead the education and training portion as it pertains to like the state commodity groups and other technical advisors for that project. And then the spring of this year came the kind of third main project that we've been working on here, and that's expanding the existing work of a multi-university cover crop breeding network and working on bringing some new cover crop varieties to market and setting up some regional testing programs and that sort of thing. So with all of that going on, we expanded our team from about 3 people to around a dozen employees in some capacity. And then just within the past month, we've launched the signups for our Circle project, which is our Missouri Climate Smart project. So there are lots of things that have kind of sprung up for our center in a very short period of time. But the overarching purpose is just to serve as an informational resource. And so we collect and create educational materials like fact sheets and videos targeted to various audiences, and we offer training programs for farmers and farm advisors. So one resource I thought might be interesting to this group that I wanted to let you know about is that we have developed these cover crop training modules, and these were made available through partnership with our center and the Midwest Cover Crop Council. We use these a lot personally as the basis for a lot of our workshops and what we like to refer to as train the trainer events, but they are open for use by other organizations. And so a handful of the slides I'll be using today has actually been adapted from some of these trainings to fit our topic today. So if you're interested in that, you can find those both on our website and on the Midwest Cover Crops website off to the left there. But being that all of us here already have an interest in cover crops, I probably don't need to harp too long about the general benefits, but I always find it a striking reminder to remember to kind of look to nature. The soils that we farm were always historically covered not with just one species. It wasn't a monoculture, it was a variety of plants as well. And that kind of is obvious to the eye, the above ground biodiversity, but what's less obvious is what goes on kind of beneath the soil surface and beneath our feet, because that diversity doesn't just stay above the ground. And just kind of, if you think of it like a hierarchy, you know, a single species cover crop is improving on your fallow ground. It's providing a living root, and that kind of begins to support your soil biology. And just so that another layer on top of that is when you start adding multiple cover crop species and you're further expanding that underground biodiversity, which of course is further supporting things like resistance to pathogens and pests and better nutrient cycling. So that's especially beneficial when we only have 2 cash crops in the rotation. And so that's why expanding our cover crops into incorporating mixes can really take your cover crop program to the next level. But when we start thinking about mixes, there are a lot of species to choose from and a lot of species that people do use. So this chart is pulled from the newest SARE CTIC ASTA National Cover Crop Survey, which was actually released yesterday. If you're not aware of that, a good way to find that is just if you just Google National Cover Crop Survey. the old ones are housed on SARE. I don't think they have the new one up yet, but the CTIC, which is Conservation Technology Information Center, their website has the new one up. So I was fortunate enough to get to help put that together some this year, and there were a lot of fantastic insights that came out of that report. And one of the things that we were asking about was cover crop mixes. And this chart here is where we were specifically asking, what species are you using in a mix? And so with us, we're seeing that not only is there a lot to choose from, but there are a lot of species that people are incorporating into their mixes. And it can be really overwhelming to kind of think about where you're even wanting to start. And so a great way to start thinking about narrowing down your species is by talking about principles, and that can help you think through why different cover crops might fit different situations. So one thing you might think about is the time of year, and that'll help you realize, are we talking summer annuals? Are we talking winter annuals? Consider your cash crops in the rotation. That kind of goes with the time of year, but you also want to be thinking ahead. So you probably want to choose something different before corn versus something you might put before a bean crop. So then you might want to think about your planting method. So some species do better drilled versus broadcast. So for example, you probably don't want to be flying on large seeded cover crops that need a specific planting depth. They're not going to do very well. Seed cost and availability. The cost one is pretty obvious, but the availability might not be as front of mind. You need to make sure you're going to be able to get it and not just obtain it, but obtain it from a reliable source. And then also thinking about your goals for the cover crop, like what are you trying to accomplish? And that's kind of what we're going to hone in on today. So a list of some possible goals that you might be thinking about. I won't spend a whole lot of time on all of these, but these are kind of a host of things that you might be trying to address with the cover crop. And you can kind of start to see the thought process of how you might go about narrowing down your species based on the goal. So if I'm thinking soil erosion, I'm thinking, I need a crop that's going to be fast growing, good rooting to anchor the soil, growth that sticks around. Soil compaction, you are thinking about maybe your root structure and how that works. Obviously legumes for nitrogen fixation. Sequestration, things that are going to pull up your nutrients, pollinator habitat are things that flower, and then weed control is just kind of trying to smother out and cover as much ground as possible. But like Tori mentioned in the introduction, today we're really going to try and zero in on two specific things you might want to think about as an example, and that would be compaction and weed control. So this picture here is something I'm sure we've all seen. You either have to get into a field when it's just a little bit too wet and you end up with something like this, and you're going to see the effects of that in the next crop. Hopefully you don't find yourself in this sort of situation. We're not going to be able to pull you out of that with a cover crop. But cover crops can maybe help prevent the situation, and then also can maybe remedy some of those issues that will come about in a less severe situation. And we typically show these pictures when talking about cover crop benefits and kind of prompt people to consider which one of these two options might be less expensive. So with your equipment, that's kind of the normal, historically, but kind of what we would tend to do with soil compaction is you're going to get out your big tractor, you're going to go out with a soil ripper and try and physically break up that compaction layer. And that can provide some temporary relief from soil compaction, but a lot of times that soil is just going to swell back together in a year or less. And so that mechanical option, you have the cost of equipment, your fuel, and your labor. And cover crops, on the other hand, there's a multi-year study that was done at Ohio State University where they found that cover crops were not only a more affordable solution, but a more effective long-term approach. And that just comes from building soil aggregate structure and soil macropores, and can kind of help reduce the chance of it occurring in the future as well. The caveat, of course, with using cover crops as a remediation for compaction is that it doesn't feel as instantaneous as just pulling out that deep soil ripper. And this is kind of why, is because yes, your deep rooting cover crops are going to help physically break up those compacted layers. But your best way to combat compaction is with building and supporting aggregation, which of course in itself is one of the huge benefits of cover crops in general. The thing with this though is that it does take time and it takes proper conditions to build, but there are some species that can help get this accomplished faster than others. And So that when we're thinking about compaction specifically and which species we might want to use in a mix, I would say we probably want to be looking for two characteristics. One would be crops that are deep rooting. So we always think of like tillage radish as the poster child for the deep rooting. And although people really think of that large tuber as the thing that's doing the work, it's much more that deep taproot that species has that can go like 5 feet down into the soil. And so once you think about that, then you can also add in a different type of root, which is a fibrous root. And it's a different structure, but it still also supports compaction. So we can think about that as being pretty much any of the grass crops or grass cover crops. So a popular mix that addresses both these things would be radishes and oats. And that's a pretty popular mix, especially for people who are just getting started with cover crops. Something to consider when using radishes in a mix, though, is that they can outcompete other species if you're not careful and you plant it pretty early. So you need to make sure that you're adjusting those rates accordingly. And there have been also some people that have combat that by maybe doing alternating rows in a sort of precision planting type of situation. And the problem, though, with this is, of course, this is a mix that is going to winter kill. So it's going to look like this. And that's where thinking about the principles of using a mix can be to our advantage. If you think back to a couple slides ago when I showed that chart of the popularity of species used in a mix, rye is not only our #1 cover crop to use as a single species, but also the one most commonly used in a mix. And that is just because there is a lot of versatility behind that cover crop beyond just the obvious, like you can seed it really late and it'll grow. So you could swap out these oats for a rye, and then you end up with kind of two benefits of using these in conjunction. First being that you have those two different type of roots going on there. So you get both the deep rooting of the radish and then also that fibrous root system of the rye, of a cereal grain. And then second, you make sure that you have something out there that is going to survive the winter and flourish in the spring. And that living root is going to continue to work on supporting your soil biology and building the soil aggregates, which are really the best way to proactively combat compaction by also preventing it. And so with that, going along those same lines, I mean, the great thing about thinking about mixes and thinking about them as far as a principles approach, kind of like this, is that you can substitute any type of winter cereal species that you prefer. So some folks really swear by annual ryegrass for compaction, for example. And the one thing that we kind of tend to caution with that is sometimes people have problems with killing it off in the spring, which we primarily see that issue if people are trying to spray it off when it's a little bit too cold out. I hear people say that as long as you wait when the weather's warm, you're not going to have a problem with it. But annual ryegrass is a good one, but you could also sub out, like we said earlier, cereal rye or wheat or triticale or something like that, and still see that similar benefit of having your multiple types of root systems in there. I included this chart, which actually comes from a really great report done by SARE, which is the Cover Crop Economics Report. And it was actually authored by Rob Myers, who is our center director, and with his affiliation with SARE. But this report summarizes at the top here the typical economics of cover crops after 1, 2, and 3 consecutive years, where usually you're kind of barely breaking even in year 3 or so. But then the report goes on to overview 7 scenarios in which cover crops may pay off faster. So one of these is a scenario where we might be able to address compaction by cover crops, in which case you're breaking even more, maybe a year earlier than you would in just normal field conditions. And if you read the report, you'll see kind of how they went about calculating these things. It assumes some savings by not having to take out a ripper like we showed in the earlier photo. But it's an interesting way to maybe find a scenario where you might get a bit of more of a return on your cover crops. And so that was the case both in corn, which is this chart, I believe. Yep, this one's corn. And then similar for soybeans, with you have a net profit kind of in that second year. So kind of switching gears to weed control, I spent about 3 summers working with crop scouting interns, and it is pretty darn apparent that the herbicide resistance issue is not going to get better anytime soon. And what I like to say about cover crops for weed control is that it's not going to fix 100% of the problem, but it's a darn good tool to have in your tool belt. So some of the characteristics you want to look for when you're thinking about what species you want to throw in a mix for weed control. Those are things that are going to get established and get going pretty quickly. Things are going to produce a lot of biomass and shade out the ground, and also things that are going to produce some lasting residue. So obviously the first one that comes to mind here is cereal rye. We see this a lot, especially before soybeans. That's a pretty popular way to use it. It checks a lot of these boxes. But the problem with using this by itself is it's not going to work in every scenario. So especially if you are concerned about trying to manage herbicide resistant weeds before corn, it's going to be pretty darn hard to let your rye get huge and then lay it down for weed control in corn, because you're going to have those issues with your nitrogen tie up. And so that's kind of where it can get beneficial to start thinking about a mix and start trying to get some other species in here. So that's where we might start looking to legumes, for example. So a great complement to that vertical growth habit of cereal rye is the more spreading growth of hairy vetch. Hairy vetch does take its time getting going in the spring, but once it takes off, it will do a fantastic job getting the ground covered, especially if you have some thin stands in some places. The one thing we like to caution people with on hairy vetch is that it does have that hard seed that can become a problem if you let it go too long. And that's mostly a concern if you have wheat in your rotation. So that's kind of probably less of a concern in Illinois as it is in Missouri, though. And if you wanted to take it even further than that, you could consider adding in some crimson clover. And that one has more of an advantage than the hairy vetch in the fall. And you can get some decent growth off of a crimson clover in the fall if you planted at a good time. And then you have that added benefit in combination with the vetch of having less nitrogen tie up. And so if you've ever read the or referenced the Managing Cover Crops Profitably book, which is also by Sarah, they mentioned that having that same mix of rye and crimson clover and hairy vetch, it can suppress weeds just as long as this all rye mat without the nutrient tie-up issues. And so this is a photo of that rye, hairy vetch, crimson clover mix. Similarly, in that same cover crop economics report, one of those other 7 situations where your cover crops might pay off faster is when you're in a scenario where you're facing those severe herbicide resistant weeds. And this is for corn. And so obviously you start to see in year 3 a pretty good return on investment for your cover crops. And see a similar thing in soybean where you see that net profit in the second year. And same thing as before, if you're kind of interested in how they come up with these numbers, you can find that report online on Sarah's website. But it assumes that you might be able to save on a herbicide application and then also the less damage to the cash crop from preventing the weeds from coming up. And I always like to end any discussion that touches on species selection with the reminder that this Midwest cover crop decision tool exists. So I'd imagine a lot of you are probably pretty familiar with us already, but I always like to remind people that this is out there. So one thing to remember too is you can kind of go beyond just that basic state and county information, and you can tell the form what your cover crop goals are and whether you have any field level concerns like drainage problems. And that's kind of where you get these numbers to the right of the names there, where it's giving you a rating for how well it is going to work with your goals. And then the green bars tell you a good range for seeding it and how well that fits with your cash crops. And so this decision tool can be another way to help you think through what kind of species you might want to think about throwing together in a mix, especially when you are trying to address a certain goal. So with that, I will stop here and open for questions. This is my email and contact information, and then also the website for the center if you are interested in clicking around there.
All right. Well, thank you, Bethany. I want to encourage everyone, go ahead and use the chat function if you have some questions that you have for Bethany. Otherwise, you're always welcome to volunteer to come off mute too. We always encourage that. So Bethany, my first question for you is sort of as it relates to compaction. If you know, I've several times I've been approached by farmers that say, you know, I want to get away from using tillage, but I need to address some compaction. maybe they're not too familiar with cover crops yet, but they want to use cover crops as a tool to address compaction. So what is your recommendation for a go-to species to begin that process? What's your favorite?
Yeah, for compaction, probably the one that we showed on the screen is a really great first time mix. The Midwest Cover Crops Council does have these sort of cover crop recipes that they put out, and the one both for Illinois and Missouri that they list for before corn especially is that radishes and rye mix. Or sorry, it's radishes and oats, because it does kill over the winter. And so if you're just getting started with cover crops, it's a nice option. You don't have to think about termination. But if they're maybe already familiar and they've done like a rye crop before, that's a good way to swap that out and get something that overwinters in there as well. If you're thinking about summer species as well, I didn't really talk about summer species, but that might come up. And sunflower is a great one for compaction, as well as you can maybe put in some sorghum sudan grass. Buckwheat is an interesting one, and kind of people aren't all on the same page about it. Some people do say it's really great for soil tilth, but we've also seen situations where it sometimes struggles in compacted soils. But sunflower is a great one for the summer.
Sure. I guess along those same lines with compaction, you talked about the physical act of breaking a compaction layer, which I think is probably how most farmers think about addressing compaction. That's why tillage has been the answer for so long. But you also mentioned the building of good soil aggregates. Maybe expand on that just a little bit and talk about how building the soil aggregates addresses compaction as opposed to just the physical act of getting a root through a compacted layer.
Yeah, so that's kind of where we switch into thinking about cover crops as a reactive tool to more of a proactive tool. And aggregates are kind of like just the structure of the soil that is giving you a little bit of resistance to getting smushed down. You talk about like the soil glues that are holding the aggregates together, and those are what is giving your soil strength and giving it resistance. And that's where you can drive across the field, and you even see people who are longtime users of cover crops reporting that they are able to get into fields earlier than their neighbors because they're not squishing down and getting stuck as much in a similar time frame after rainfall, for example.
Sure. We have a question. Says, do you have any advice on deciding on a planting date or depth for a cover crop mix with species that vary in their individual recommendations?
Yeah. So dates. So again, it kind of depends what you're going for, right? If you if you're doing radishes and you really want to make sure that you get that taproot way down in the ground, you are going to want to get that in earlier because it's going to winter kill. So the only chance you have for growth is going to be in the fall. So you'd want to err toward going a little bit earlier with that. If you're doing more of something that is going to overwinter and you have one that's going to be strong in the fall and the other one's going to come out in the spring, you can probably push it a little bit later. We do see that, especially when things are in a mix, they tend to have a little bit better winter survivability than if it is a single species stand. And so sometimes in that scenario, you might be able to push it back a little bit later than you would with a single species. So it kind of goes back to thinking about what's more important for me in which one do I care about the most, in erring more toward the side of that species. And then if something else comes up, you can kind of consider it an added bonus. But you are going to want to kind of prioritize in your mind which one you want to emphasize.
I guess I'll switch gears a little bit to kind of the weed control side of things. Often the economic return from a cover crop in terms of weed control is when you get to the point where you can start to cut out or cut back on your herbicide pass. Mm-hmm. Can you give us an idea of what can farmers typically expect? Because if they say, well, okay, I want to put the cereal rye before my soybeans, but I'm just not comfortable cutting back on my herbicide program. At what point should a farmer start to become comfortable in cutting back on a herbicide program when using good biomass cover crop like cereal rye?
Yeah, I always ask this question myself of experienced farmers that are getting into this sort of thing. And even they are never really like sure about a solid answer. But as with anything, cover crops, a good way to start is to do it on like a small area. So if you have maybe one field or a section of the field that you want to start with and kind of test it out and see how far you can get with just the cover crop by itself, that's a great way to kind of start testing the waters of, can I really rely on this cover crop and smothering these weeds more than a herbicide application, or do I still kind of need to do some work in building up the things I'm trying to get done in my soil? And so, yeah, with anything, just kind of start small and experiment with it. There's definitely no prescriptive way of, if you do it for 3 years, then you're good. So it definitely comes down to a field by field, and also personal preference and how much risk you're willing to take on that.
Sure. That's good information. I think that there's a lot of room for adjusting herbicide programs when you have a good, for instance, cereal rye. But again, it's one of those things that it depends on your weed species. It might depend on the year. And I think a lot of folks just need to kind of weigh those options year in and year out. So we have another question. It says, I've read, this is from Olivia. I've read that you should avoid planting a grass before corn or a legume before soy. How does this rule of thumb apply when planting a cover crop mix?
Yeah, the rule for that is largely when it comes to diseases. It's the same reason that we don't really want to do corn on corn year after year. Is you're going to have issues.
We're in northern Illinois. We have a lot of corn on corn.
Yeah, well, I know that, but that's you can't do that without starting to see some of the issues and the disease carryover and things like that. And so that's why best practice, because we also see a lot of beans on beans in Missouri, which I thought was interesting coming there from Illinois. It was very uncommon to me. And so that's a situation where cover crops can help in that situation, where you're maybe breaking up that disease cycle a little bit, as well as getting your diversity in. But especially with the grass species before corn, as well as you have those issues with the nitrogen tie-up. And as long as you have some other stuff going on there, that can be helpful, but you're still probably going to be wanting to put some nitrogen on in the spring. Same thing with legumes before soybeans. Part of the reason with that is your residue as well. It's not going to be as persistent, and you already have that thing with the residue with the soybeans not being as much residue, of course, as a corn cover crop. And I'm losing my track here, but I think you get what I'm going at here, Tori.
Sure. With weed control, I've experienced this with some farmers that I've worked with in the past. When the rye cover crop ahead of soybeans can actually be laid down on the soil surface, often that's when we see the best weed suppression. Can you talk a little bit about the mechanism for how that works? Is it purely shade? I've been told too that it's largely due to, particularly with small seeded broadleaves like water hemp, it fools the seed into feeling that it's buried deeper in the soil, so it just simply doesn't germinate because it feels it doesn't have a good chance of survival. Can you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, it's both that action of shading it out, but there's also a little bit of allelopathy that goes on with cereal rye, where especially with those small seeded weeds, it has a little bit of action of that chemical that kind of prevents them from germinating. I know that's one area that people are interested in doing more research about, because we don't understand a whole lot about how that works. Because then people have that concern of, okay, if it's allelopathic, is it giving me problems with corn? That's kind of where you see, well, corn's a larger seed than your smaller seeded weeds, for example. But there's a little bit of, it's speculated that there's both that action of shading out the ground and suppressing them physically, but as well as that crop allelopathy that might have a little bit to do with it as well.
Sure, that makes sense. Any other questions? I've got a few that I can probably come up with, but I want to encourage members of the audience, please continue to throw questions out. Anybody, shout it out. Come off mute if you've got a question. Now's the time. I don't know if I can see everybody, see if anybody raises their hand or anything, but
stop my share. I can see people better.
Sure. Getting back a little bit to using annual ryegrass to address compaction. That's the species we hear a lot about for addressing compaction, the fibrous root system, the ability to penetrate some very compacted layers deep into the soil. but again, like you said, it can be an issue in terms of spring termination, and often that's because the root mass is not reflective of what we see above ground. It often has a whole lot more root system than what it has above ground growth. So we're told to treat it as though you're terminating an established pasture. And you mentioned weather conditions. Can you just expand a little bit more on how annual ryegrass should be managed when addressing compaction?
Yeah, well, when it comes to termination, this is all what I've kind of been told by farmers who swear by it, and they get mad because we've got some weed people in Missouri that are like, you have resistance issues with annual ryegrass, you need to be careful with it. And then I have farmers that are saying like, no, absolutely not. If you just know how to manage it, you'll be fine. And so, like I said, the main thing I've heard about that is if you just wait for those warmer temperatures, I hear that that's the best way to go about doing it. As far as like specifics on when that is, I would look that up and ask somebody else because I don't have that top of mind. But from what I've heard from farmers is it's, just make sure your weather conditions are fine and you're going to be good.
Does anybody on the call have experience using annual ryegrass either on your farm or on a client's farm? We'd love to hear what your experience is with it. I don't have a whole lot of firsthand experience using it. Although I've seen soil pits in southern Illinois where there's fragipan soil and annual ryegrass that's only 2 or 3 inches of above ground growth has roots down 18, 24 inches and penetrating some very, very tough layers of soil and starting to get some root channels through there. So definitely a good tool in the toolbox.
Yeah, I can chime in there. Just kind of our management experiences. So we've planted. We haven't planted in years after a bad experience, but we had several years of really good experiences. So just some of the local management advice was as far as timing. Usually by the time you need to mow your lawn twice is kind of when that ideal termination window is here, just to make sure that it is actively growing. We always felt, again, just be careful with mixes, right? If you're going to have, any kind of like a weed and feed application is not the way to kill your annual ryegrass. Be careful with mixes that tie up, round up in any way or work against it. Something like an atrazine is not going to be a good mix in there either. And I think you can even take it the direction of looking at your water pH, right? Even that stuff's not going to hurt you. And then the biggest one we found was just weather. So watching not only what your weather is, say 2 to 3 days before, but at least 2 to 3 days after. You want warm, sunny weather after. And I think that's kind of what we ran into that year is forecast changed and just a few kind of cooler, cloudy days. And yeah, everything else died, but you could about row that annual ryegrass. So yeah, it's pretty impressive, and a lot of things can go wrong, but it is a good plant if you can manage it correctly.
Thank you, Frank. That's good information. Bethany, I'll kind of turn it back over to you. And is there anything else you want to expand on? We've got a few minutes left for Q&A, so if anybody has any more questions, please feel free. But if there's anything else you want to expand on, can you tell us a little bit more about any of the work that you're doing there at the Center for Regenerative Ag?
Yeah, I mean, right now this doesn't really affect our folks in Missouri, or sorry, our folks in Illinois. It's mostly Missouri, but right now I'm just in the midst of enrolling folks in some cover crop sign up. And so it's going to be, I think, really interesting working with those folks. We're going to have some people that are brand new to cover crops and people that have been doing it for a while. You all might find it interesting the way that we're going about it a little bit differently. Rather than only planting incentives, we're also having a couple options for an incentive for late termination, which we're calling anything May 1st or later, as well as cover crop grazing. So something interesting that I found moving, from Illinois to Missouri is how much more prevalent the livestock is next to crop fields. And so we're trying to incentivize them to kind of work on reintegrating those two things and kind of maybe put some livestock out on some cover crops. So that's maybe something interesting to hear about, is that we're going about that a little bit differently, and that'll be an interesting project to see as we go forward over the next 5 years. So that's front of mind for us right now, that we're in the thick of it on those signups.
Yeah, no, that's good. We've got a lot of that going on here in Illinois as well. So I guess along those lines, this is something I kind of ask all the cover crop gurus that I get to speak with in my job here. But what's the one piece of advice to somebody who's never done cover crops before? What's the one piece of advice that you would give them if they're at least considering it, or maybe a little bit skeptical about trying it?
Yeah, and I alluded to this point earlier, but I always say you just want to start small. So if you're thinking about it, put it on a small piece of ground that you're willing to accept risk on, and just build it from there. You can take baby steps. You don't have to put your whole operation into a zero rye and then plant it green the next year to get started. You can just start small, start with something that winter kills, and get comfortable with the fall seeding. And that's a great way to get started.
Yeah, agreed. Do we have any other questions that anybody has, or any questions, comments, anything that anybody wants to add to this discussion? Otherwise, I think we'll probably move on to our wrap-up phase for today's call. Not seeing any new questions. Feel free to come off mute too. We love it. We have our QR code for CCAs if you wish to receive CEU credit. Please go ahead and scan that. We'll also have the Google form. You can put your information in there as well. While I'm thinking about it, I better get my credits as well. Always a good option. Yeah, and then if anybody has any other events or anything that they'd like to promote, let us know. Anything that's going on that people may want to attend. Now's the time. We will wrap up our summer cover crop cocktail series next month on September 13th. We will be having a presentation on cover crop mixes for wildlife habitat and biodiversity. So we are looking forward to that. I know I'm looking forward to hearing more and more about wildlife habitat and biodiversity. And then we are not planning on having a call in October, assuming that everyone will be busy with harvest. So we hope to pick up. I think we're probably going to try and pick up again in November, but there will be no October call. So we want everybody to be aware of that. We hope to see everybody in September. Again, anybody have any other updates from anybody on the network? If there's any events, field days, learning opportunities, please let us know. And if not, I think we'll go ahead, and I think we have a closing poll, an exit poll for you. We're going to take a minute to answer those questions. All right, I think we probably have all our responses in. There we go. Excellent. All right. Well, with that, I think we'll go ahead and get things wrapped up. Bethany, thank you very much for your presentation. Thank you for joining us. Hope to have you back on some future calls either as a presenter or audience member. We always love to have you. So I think we'll go ahead and bring things to a conclusion here. So thank you again, and I hope to see everybody in September. Have a good day, everyone.
Thanks for having me. See you later.
Thank you.